Chapter 1 New City, New Laura. Laura Cruz had never been a fan of dramatic life changes. She liked her routines neat and predictable, like a well-organized spreadsheet. But here she was, standing in the middle of her new apartment, surrounded by cardboard boxes and the faint smell of fresh paint, wondering if she'd made the right decision. The city outside her window buzzed with life, horns honking, laughter spilling from sidewalk cafes, the occasional bark of a dog chasing something invisible. It was louder than her old town, brighter, and definitely more expensive. But it was hers now, her new chapter. She tugged her hair into a messy bun and surveyed the chaos. A box labeled kitchen stuff sat on the couch like it had given up on life. Another, marked books, leaned against the wall, threatening to topple. Laura sighed, grabbed her phone, and opened the delivery app. Cooking could wait. Tonight called for takeout and maybe a glass of wine. Her phone buzzed with a notification. Welcome to the city. Here are local events near you. She scrolled past yoga classes, pottery workshops, and something called silent disco for introverts. Then one listing caught her eye. Paranormal Investigators Meetup, Wednesdays, 7 p.m., City Library. Laura's lips curved into a slow smile. Well, that was unexpected. She wasn't a believer. Not really. Ghosts, spirits, poltergeists, those were things that belonged in horror movies and late-night cable specials. But ever since college, she'd been fascinated by the idea of the unexplained. Not because she wanted to believe, but because she wanted to understand. Every bump in the night had a reason. Every shadow had a source. And Laura loved finding those reasons. Back in her old town, she joined a few paranormal groups. Most were harmless fun. People with EMF meters and shaky flashlights, whispering dramatically in abandoned houses. Laura had been the voice of reason, the one who pointed out the drafty windows and faulty wiring. They didn't always appreciate her skepticism, but she didn't care. She wasn't there to make friends. She was there for the puzzle. Now, in this new city, she felt that itch again. The curiosity, the thrill of peeling back layers of mystery until only logic remained. She bookmarked the event and tossed her phone onto the couch. Wednesday was 2 days away. Plenty of time to decide if she wanted to dive back into that world, or keep her evenings reserved for Netflix and solitude. The next morning, Laura woke to sunlight streaming through half-closed blinds and the distant hum of traffic. Her alarm chirped cheerfully, reminding her that she had a job now. A real, grown-up, 9-to-5 job that paid the bills and didn't make her want to ram her head into a wall. Progress. She dressed in her usual office armor. Tailored slacks, a soft blouse, and flats that whispered competent but approachable. Her new workplace was a mid-sized marketing firm with an open floor plan and a coffee machine that deserved its own Instagram account. She liked it there. The people were friendly, the projects interesting enough, and no one had asked her to join a mandatory trust fall exercise. Yet, "Morning, Laura," chirped Jenna from the desk across the aisle. Jenna was the kind of person who could make small talk sound like an Olympic sport. "Morning," Laura replied with a smile, setting her bag down. She powered up her computer and scanned her inbox. A few client emails, a reminder about Friday's team lunch, and, oh joy, a spreadsheet that needed untangling. As she worked, snippets of conversation floated around her. Weekend plans, office gossip, someone debating the merits of oat milk versus almond milk. Normal stuff, comfortable stuff. And yet, Laura felt that familiar tug. The part of her that didn't belong here, the part that craved something stranger, something that couldn't be explained by marketing metrics or quarterly reports. She would never tell them about her hobby. That was a life that belonged to her alone. By Wednesday evening, Laura had made up her mind. Curiosity won. She stood outside the city library, clutching a tote bag like it was a shield. The building loomed against the twilight sky, its glass doors glowing warmly. Inside, she could see clusters of people chatting near a sign that read, "Paranormal Investigators, Meeting Room B." Laura took a deep breath and stepped inside. The room smelled faintly of old books and coffee. A circle of chairs filled the space, occupied by a mix of people. Some young, some older, all wearing expressions that ranged from eager to solemn. On a table nearby sat an assortment of gadgets, EMF meters, voice recorders, even what looked like a thermal camera. Laura's eyebrows lifted. At least they had equipment. That was promising. "Hi there." A man with tousled dark hair and a grin that could power a small city approached her. He wore jeans, a faded t-shirt, and the kind of confidence that suggested he'd never doubted a ghost in his life. "First time." "Yeah," Laura said, adjusting her tote strap. "Just checking things out." "I'm Ethan," he said, offering his hand. "Co-leader of the group. We're a friendly bunch, promise." Laura shook his hand, noting the warmth of his grip and the spark of amusement in his eyes. "Laura." "Welcome, Laura." He gestured toward the circle. "Grab a seat. We're just about to start." Laura slid into an empty chair, her skeptic's radar on high alert. Ethan moved to the front, clapping his hands for attention. "All right, team," he said, voice smooth and confident. "Tonight, we're planning our next investigation. The old Crescent Theater downtown. Lots of reports of activity. Cold spots, voices, even a full-bodied apparition." Laura bit back a smile. Full-bodied apparition. Sure. As the group launched into discussion, Laura listened, her mind cataloging details. Drafty building? Probably. Voices? Acoustics can play tricks. Apparition? Lighting, imagination, or both. Still, she felt a flicker of excitement. Not because she believed, but because she loved the challenge. And then Ethan glanced her way, his grin widening like he could read her thoughts. What do you think, Laura? Ready to hunt some ghosts? Laura met his gaze, her lips curving into a slow, deliberate smile. I think, she said, I'm ready to find out what's really going on. Ethan chuckled, eyes gleaming. I like you already. Laura wasn't sure if that was a compliment or a warning. Either way, she had a feeling her quiet, predictable life had just taken a sharp turn into the unknown. Chapter 2, First Contact. Laura had expected a handful of people sitting in a dim corner of the library, whispering about ghosts like they were planning a seance. What she got instead was, well, organized chaos. The meeting room buzzed with energy. A dozen chairs formed a loose circle, and every seat was filled except the one Laura had claimed. People chatted animatedly, passing around notebooks and coffee cups. On the side table, the gadgets she'd noticed earlier were now spread out like a buffet of paranormal tech, EMF meters blinking green, a thermal camera humming softly, and a voice recorder that looked suspiciously expensive. Laura perched on the edge of her chair, her tote bag tucked neatly at her feet. She wasn't nervous, exactly. She'd done this before. But something about this group felt different, less like a hobby club and more like a team. A team with matching enthusiasm and, judging by the equipment, matching budgets. Ethan stood at the front, leaning casually against the table like he owned the room. His dark hair was slightly tousled, his grin easy and confident. Laura hated that grin already. It was the kind of grin that said, I know something you don't. And Laura didn't like not knowing things. All right, everyone, Ethan said, clapping his hands. Let's get started. First, quick introductions for our new member. His gaze flicked to Laura, and that grin widened. Laura, right? She nodded. Laura Cruz. Welcome, Laura. Ethan gestured toward the group. We're the Crescent City Paranormal Society. We investigate local hauntings, collect evidence, and try to make sense of the unexplained. Emphasis on try. He winked and a few people chuckled. Laura smiled politely. Sounds interesting. Tell us about you, Ethan said, folding his arms. What brings you here? Believer? Skeptic? Somewhere in between. Laura hesitated, then decided honesty was best. Skeptic, she said. I've been in a few groups before. I like the process, the research. But so far, everything I've seen has had a logical explanation. A ripple of murmurs passed through the circle. One woman with bright purple hair leaned forward, eyes sparkling. Oh, a skeptic. We love skeptics. Keeps us honest. Ethan's grin didn't falter. Perfect. We need someone to keep us grounded. But fair warning, this city has history. You might find it harder to explain things away. Laura arched a brow. Challenge accepted. The group laughed, and Ethan's eyes gleamed like he'd just won a bet. Laura wasn't sure if she liked that look. Introductions rolled on. There was Maya, the purple-haired enthusiast who claimed she could sense energy shifts. Tom, a retired electrician who swore he'd seen a ghost in his attic. Sophie, a soft-spoken librarian with a passion for EVP recordings. And Greg, who looked like he'd stepped out of a survivalist catalog and spoke in monosyllables. Laura listened, filing away details. They weren't frauds, at least not on the surface. They seemed genuinely curious, maybe even sincere. That was good. She could work with sincere. When the introductions ended, Ethan launched into the agenda. Next investigation. Crescent Theater. Built in 1923, closed in the late 80s, reopened as a community venue. Reports of cold spots, disembodied voices, and my personal favorite, a full-bodied apparition in the balcony. Laura bit back a smile. Full-bodied apparition. Again with that, Ethan continued. We'll meet there Saturday night, 9 p.m. Bring your gear, your courage, and your best ghost jokes. Do we need permission? Laura asked, her practical side kicking in. Already cleared, Ethan said smoothly. The manager's a friend. He's curious too. Laura nodded, impressed despite herself. At least they were organized. After the meeting, people lingered, chatting and comparing gadgets. Laura drifted toward the table, eyeing the equipment. She picked up an EMF meter, its lights blinking like a tiny Christmas tree. Careful, Ethan said, appearing at her elbow. That little guy's sensitive. Laura turned the device over in her hands. Electromagnetic field detector, right? Measures fluctuations in EMF levels. Ethan's brows lifted. You know your stuff. I read, Laura said lightly, setting the meter down. And I like facts. Facts are good, Ethan said, his grin returning. But sometimes, facts don't tell the whole story. Laura met his gaze, her tone cool but playful. Or sometimes, people see what they want to see. Ethan chuckled. Touché. Guess we'll find out Saturday. Laura smiled faintly. Guess we will. As she walked out of the library, the night air crisp against her skin, Laura felt a flicker of anticipation. Not for ghosts, she still didn't believe in those, but for the challenge, for the puzzle, and maybe, just maybe, for the man with the infuriating grin who seemed determined to prove her wrong. Chapter 3, The Dare. Saturday night arrived with the kind of chill that made Laura question her life choices. She stood outside the Crescent Theater, its faded marquee looming overhead like a relic from another era. The building had character: cracked brick, peeling paint, and a faint smell of dust and nostalgia. Perfect for a ghost story. Or, more realistically, perfect for creaky floorboards and drafty windows. Laura adjusted her scarf and scanned the sidewalk. The group was gathering near the entrance, bundled in jackets and buzzing with excitement. Maya had a backpack stuffed with gadgets. Tom carried a flashlight the size of a baseball bat, and Sophie clutched a notebook like it was a talisman. Greg, as usual, looked like he was preparing for a wilderness expedition rather than a theater visit. And then there was Ethan. He leaned against the doorframe, hands in his pockets, wearing a black jacket that somehow managed to look both casual and annoyingly stylish. His grin was already in place, like he'd been saving it just for her. "Laura," he said, pushing off the frame. "Glad you made it." "Wouldn't miss it," she replied, her tone dry but her pulse betraying her calm exterior. She wasn't sure if it was the cold or the way his eyes seemed to sparkle under the streetlight. "Ready to meet our resident ghost?" Ethan asked, falling into step beside her as the group headed inside. "Ready to meet a draft and some bad wiring," Laura said sweetly. Ethan chuckled. "You really don't believe in any of this, do you?" "I believe in facts," Laura said. "And so far, ghosts haven't made the list." "Then let's make it interesting." Ethan stopped just inside the lobby, where the air smelled faintly of old velvet and forgotten applause. He turned to face her, his grin widening. "If you find something tonight that you can't explain, something genuinely unexplainable, you buy me coffee." Laura arched a brow. "And if I don't? Then I buy you coffee," Ethan said, his voice smooth as silk. "Either way, we get coffee." Laura stared at him, trying to decide if this was a challenge or a flirtation. Probably both. "Fine," she said, her lips curving into a slow smile. "But when I win, I'm ordering the most expensive thing on the menu." "Deal," Ethan said, his grin turning downright wicked. "Hope you like whipped cream." The group spread out, their voices echoing softly in the cavernous space. The theater was beautiful in a faded, melancholy way. Rows of red velvet seats, a stage draped in dusty curtains, and a balcony that loomed like a shadowed secret. Laura followed Ethan up the creaking stairs, her flashlight slicing through the darkness. "So," Ethan said casually, "what's your theory on ghosts? Just mass hysteria?" "Not hysteria," Laura said, stepping carefully over a loose board. "People see what they expect to see. Shadows, sounds, they interpret them through the lens of belief. Add a little adrenaline, and suddenly every draft is a spirit." Ethan glanced at her, his expression amused. "You sound like a psychology textbook." "Better than sounding like a horror movie," Laura shot back. He laughed, the sound warm and easy in the cold air. "Fair enough." They reached the balcony, where the alleged apparition had been spotted. Laura swept her flashlight across the rows of seats, noting the dust motes dancing like tiny ghosts in the beam. "So, where's our phantom?" "Patience," Ethan said, setting up a voice recorder on the railing. "Spirits don't punch a time clock." Laura smirked. "Convenient." Ethan ignored the jab, pulling out an EMF meter. The lights flickered green, steady and calm. "Baseline reading," he murmured, then glanced at her. "Want to try?" Laura hesitated, then took the device. It felt lighter than she expected, almost flimsy. She watched the lights, waiting for a spike that never came. "Looks normal. For now," Ethan said, his tone teasing. "Give it time." The investigation unfolded in a mix of hushed voices and creaking floorboards. Maya claimed she felt energy shifts near the stage. Tom swore he heard a whisper in the wings. Laura, meanwhile, catalogued every sound. The groan of old wood, the hum of distant traffic, the faint drip of water somewhere in the walls. All explainable, all ordinary. And yet, there was something about the theater. A weight in the air, a sense of being watched. Laura told herself it was the power of suggestion, nothing more. But when her flashlight flickered, just for a second, she felt a prickle at the back of her neck. "Loose connection," she muttered, tapping the handle. Still, her pulse quickened. Ethan noticed. Of course he did. "Everything okay?" "Fine," Laura said, a little too quickly. His grin softened into something gentler. "You know, it's okay to admit when something feels off." Laura met his gaze, her voice steady. "I'll admit it when I see proof." Ethan smiled, slow and knowing. "Can't wait." By midnight, the group packed up, their chatter lively with theories and excitement. Laura walked out into the cold night, her breath fogging in the air. She hadn't seen a ghost. She hadn't heard a voice. But she couldn't shake the feeling that the theater had whispered something to her. Something she couldn't quite name. And then Ethan fell into step beside her, his grin back in full force. "So, coffee?" Laura shot him a look. "Nice try. You didn't win." "Not yet," Ethan said, his tone rich with promise. But the night's young. Laura laughed, shaking her head. You're impossible. Maybe, Ethan said, his eyes gleaming. But admit it, you're curious. Laura didn't answer. She didn't have to. The truth was written all over her smile. Chapter 4 Haunted Beginnings. The Crescent Theater looked different at night. Not just darker, older, heavier, like the weight of its history pressed against the walls. Laura stood in the lobby, her breath fogging in the cold air, and wondered if she was imagining it. Probably. She was good at imagining things. That's what skepticism did. It made you notice every creak, every shadow, every whisper of wind. The group was already setting up. Maya arranged her crystals on the ticket counter like she was preparing for a seance. Tom fiddled with his flashlight, muttering about batteries. Sophie checked her voice recorder, her expression serene, as if she were about to interview a ghost for a podcast. Greg, predictably, was testing a rope for reasons Laura didn't want to know. And then Ethan appeared, carrying a tripod and wearing that grin, the one that made Laura want to roll her eyes and maybe, just maybe, smile back. Ready for round 2? He asked, his voice warm against the chill. Laura adjusted her scarf. Ready to prove you wrong. Ethan chuckled. You're relentless. I'm thorough, Laura corrected, following him toward the stage. There's a difference. The plan was simple. Split into pairs, cover different sections of the theater, and document everything. Laura ended up with Ethan, of course. Maya winked at her as they headed toward the balcony, and Laura pretended not to notice. The stairs groaned under their weight, each step echoing like a warning. Laura swept her flashlight across the walls, noting the peeling paint and water stains. This place is a structural nightmare, she said. If anyone hears knocking, it's probably the building begging for repairs. Or a ghost begging for attention, Ethan countered, his grin flashing in the dim light. Laura smirked. You really believe that, don't you? I believe in possibilities, Ethan said, setting up the tripod near the railing. And in keeping an open mind. Laura crouched to examine the floorboards. Open mind, sure. But not so open your brain falls out. Ethan laughed, the sound rich and easy. You're fun, you know that? Laura glanced up, her pulse skipping for reasons she refused to analyze. I'm practical. Practical can be fun, Ethan said, his tone teasing. Especially when it's stubborn. They worked in companionable silence for a while, setting up equipment and taking baseline readings. The EMF meter stayed steady, the temperature normal. Laura felt smug. Science was winning. Then the lights flickered. Just for a second, like a breath held and released. Laura froze, her flashlight beam jittering across the seats. Loose wiring, she said automatically, though her voice lacked conviction. Ethan's grin softened into something almost tender. You okay? Fine, Laura said, straightening. Just surprised. Surprised is good, Ethan murmured, his eyes lingering on hers. Means you're paying attention. Laura looked away, focusing on the railing. Let's finish the sweep. They moved deeper into the balcony, the air growing colder with each step. Laura told herself it was the draft, nothing more. But when the floor shifted under her foot, sudden, sharp, she gasped. The board gave way. Laura stumbled, her flashlight clattering to the floor. Before she could fall, Ethan's arm shot out, wrapping around her waist and pulling her against him. The world tilted, then steadied, her heart pounding like a drum. Got you? Ethan said, his voice low, his breath warm against her ear. Laura blinked, her hands gripping his jacket. For a moment, the theater vanished. The dust, the darkness, the whispers, and all she felt was the solid strength of him, the heat of his body, the way his heartbeat seemed to echo hers. Thanks, she managed, her voice barely above a whisper. Ethan's grin returned, softer now. Anytime. They stood like that for a beat too long before Laura stepped back, her cheeks flushed. Floor's unstable, she said briskly, retrieving her flashlight. We should mark it. Already on it? Ethan said, pulling a piece of tape from his pocket. His tone was casual, but his eyes held something Laura wasn't ready to name. The rest of the night passed in a blur of shadows and whispers. Maya claimed she saw movement near the stage. Sophie recorded what she swore was a voice saying leave. Tom nearly dropped his flashlight when a door slammed in the wings. Laura explained every incident. Drafts, acoustics, old hinges. But her certainty felt thinner than before. When they finally packed up, the theater seemed to exhale, its secrets tucked back into the dark. Laura stepped outside, the cold air biting her cheeks, and tried to shake the lingering tension. Ethan fell into step beside her, his grin back in place. Still think it's all wiring and wind? Laura hesitated, then smiled faintly. Mostly, Ethan repeated, his voice rich with amusement. I'll take that as progress. Laura laughed, shaking her head. You're impossible. Maybe, Ethan said, his eyes gleaming. But admit it, you're curious. Laura didn't answer. She didn't have to. The truth was written all over her smile. Chapter 5 Coffee and Contradictions. Laura had planned to spend Sunday morning in bed with a book and a bottomless mug of coffee. Instead, She found herself sitting across from Ethan Hale at a corner table in a cozy cafe that smelled like cinnamon and ambition. The place was charming. Exposed brick walls, mismatched chairs, and a chalkboard menu boasting drinks with names like Midnight Mocha and Haunted Hazelnut. Laura ordered a plain latte. Ethan, of course, went for the Haunted Hazelnut. Because of course he did. So, Ethan said, sliding his phone onto the table. Ready to review the evidence? Laura sipped her latte, the warmth soothing her nerves. Ready to debunk the evidence. Ethan grinned, that infuriating grin that made her want to argue and maybe laugh at the same time. We'll see. He tapped his phone and a video appeared, a grainy shot of the theater balcony, recorded from the tripod camera. The image wavered slightly, the sound a low hum of silence. Watch, Ethan said, leaning closer. Laura caught a whiff of his cologne. Clean, warm, with a hint of spice, and immediately told herself not to notice. On the screen, the empty balcony stretched in eerie stillness. Then, faintly, a shadow flickered across the far wall. Quick, subtle, gone in an instant. Laura frowned. Lighting glitch. Except there was no light source over there, Ethan said, his voice calm but smug. Could have been the camera adjusting, Laura countered. Autofocus can cause shifts. Ethan chuckled. You have an answer for everything. That's called logic, Laura said, her tone crisp. You should try it sometime. He laughed, the sound rich and easy. Touché. Next came the audio. Ethan played a clip from Sophie's recorder. A faint whisper, barely audible, like breath against glass. Laura leaned in, straining to catch the words. Leave, or maybe leaf. Hard to tell. Could be background noise, she said. Air vents, pipes. In a building that old? Ethan raised a brow. Possible. But listen again. Laura did, and the whisper curled down her spine like smoke. She hated that it made her shiver. Still not proof, she said firmly, sitting back. Correlation isn't causation. Ethan smiled, slow and knowing. You're stubborn. I'm rational, Laura corrected. Rational can be stubborn, Ethan teased. Especially when it's cute. Laura blinked, heat rushing to her cheeks. Excuse me? Ethan's grin widened. What? It's a compliment. Laura stared at him, torn between indignation and laughter. You're impossible. Maybe, Ethan said, his tone softening. But admit it, you're intrigued. Laura hesitated, her fingers curling around her mug. She wanted to say no. She wanted to cling to certainty. But the truth was, she was intrigued. Not by ghosts, at least not entirely, but by the way Ethan looked at her like she was a puzzle he wanted to solve. Maybe, she said finally, her voice quiet. Ethan's smile turned warm, almost gentle. Progress. They lingered over coffee, their conversation drifting from ghosts to music to the best pizza in the city. Laura found herself laughing more than she expected, her skepticism softening under the weight of easy banter and stolen glances. When they finally stepped outside, the winter sun glinting off the sidewalk, Ethan held the door for her. Next investigation's Friday, he said. Historic inn. Lots of activity. Laura raised a brow. Activity or bad plumbing? Guess you'll have to come and find out, Ethan said, his grin flashing like a dare. Laura smiled, her breath fogging in the cold. Guess I will. Chapter 6, Signals and Secrets. The historic inn was the kind of place that looked like it had secrets. Its brick facade glowed faintly under the streetlights, ivy curling along the edges like green whispers. Laura stood on the sidewalk, clutching her tote bag, and wondered if she was about to spend her Friday night chasing shadows, or something worse. Inside, the air smelled of old wood and faint lavender, the kind of scent that clung to places with too much history. The lobby was dim, its wallpaper faded, its chandelier casting fractured light across the worn carpet. Laura scanned the space, her skeptic's radar humming. Drafts? Check. Uneven flooring? Check. Plenty of opportunities for creaks and groans to masquerade as ghosts. The group gathered near the front desk, buzzing with excitement. Maya was practically vibrating, her purple hair catching the light like a neon sign. Tom adjusted his flashlight with the solemnity of a surgeon. Sophie clutched her recorder, her expression serene, while Greg muttered something about structural integrity and ropes. And then Ethan appeared, carrying a duffel bag and wearing that grin, the one that made Laura want to argue and laugh in equal measure. Ready for some history? He asked, his voice warm against the chill. Ready to explain history, Laura said, her tone dry. Preferably without invoking spirits. Ethan chuckled. You're consistent. I like that. Laura rolled her eyes, but her lips twitched. Let's just get this over with. They split into pairs again, Laura and Ethan assigned to the east wing, where most of the reported activity had occurred. The hallway stretched long and narrow, lined with doors that looked like they hadn't been opened in decades. Laura swept her flashlight across the peeling wallpaper, noting the faint patterns of roses and vines. Creepy? Ethan murmured, his grin flashing in the dim light. Old, Laura corrected. There's a difference. Old can be creepy, Ethan said, his tone teasing. Especially when it whispers. Laura smirked. If the wallpaper starts talking, I'll reconsider my stance. They set up equipment in one of the larger rooms, a faded parlor with a cracked mirror and a fireplace that hadn't seen flames in years. Laura checked the EMF meter, watching the steady green lights. Normal, predictable, comforting. Then the temperature dropped. Not dramatically, just enough for Laura to notice the chill against her skin. She frowned, scanning the room. Draft, she said automatically, moving toward the window. But the glass was intact, the frame sealed tight. Could be insulation, she muttered, though her voice lacked conviction. Ethan watched her, his expression unreadable. Or something else. Laura shot him a look. Don't start. He smiled, slow and gentle. Not starting, just observing. They continued the sweep, their voices low, the silence pressing like a weight. Laura told herself it was the building, the age, the acoustics, the way shadows pooled in corners. But when the EMF meter spiked, sudden, sharp, her breath caught. She stared at the blinking lights, her pulse quickening. Could be interference, she said quickly. Wiring, appliances. In a room with no power? Ethan's voice was soft, almost tender. Laura swallowed hard, her fingers tightening on the device. There's an explanation. Maybe, Ethan said, his eyes holding hers. But maybe not. They sat on the edge of a faded sofa, the EMF meter steady again, the silence thick. Laura felt the weight of her own thoughts pressing against her ribs. She hated uncertainty, hated cracks in her logic. And yet, she couldn't shake the chill that lingered in the air, or the way her skin prickled like static. Why do you believe? She asked suddenly, her voice quiet. Ethan blinked, surprised by the question. Then his expression softened, shadows flickering across his face. Because I've seen things I can't explain, he said. And because, when I was 12, my sister died. Laura's breath caught. I'm sorry. Ethan nodded, his gaze distant. After the funeral, I started hearing her voice. Not in dreams, in the house. Little things. A laugh. A whisper. I thought I was losing my mind. But then, my mom heard it too. Laura stared at him, her skepticism faltering under the weight of his words. Could have been grief, she said gently. Auditory hallucinations. Maybe, Ethan said, his smile faint. But when you hear someone say your name, clear as day, in an empty room, it changes you. Laura didn't know what to say. Logic felt thin, fragile, like paper in the rain. She looked at him, really looked, and saw the truth in his eyes, not proof but belief. And for the first time, she wondered if belief was its own kind of evidence. They sat in silence, the EMF meter blinking softly on the table. Laura felt something shift inside her. A crack in the armor, a whisper of doubt, or maybe curiosity. She wasn't sure which scared her more. When they finally packed up, the night air felt sharper, the stars brighter. Ethan walked beside her, his voice low. Still think it's all wiring and wind? Laura hesitated, then smiled faintly. Mostly, Ethan chuckled. I'll take that. Laura laughed softly, shaking her head. You're impossible. Maybe, Ethan said, his eyes warm. But admit it, you're starting to wonder. Laura didn't answer. She didn't have to. The truth was written all over her silence. Chapter 7, The Rivalry Intensifies. Laura had never been locked in a room before. At least, not with a man who smelled like cedar and confidence and had a grin that could power a small city. It started innocently enough. The group had returned to the inn for a follow-up investigation, determined to capture more evidence after last week's anomalies. Laura had agreed, partly because she wanted to prove Ethan wrong, and partly because she couldn't stop thinking about the way his voice had softened when he told her about his sister. The east wing was colder tonight, the air heavy with silence. Laura and Ethan were assigned to the same parlor as before, its cracked mirror glinting faintly in the flashlight beam. They set up equipment, EMF meters, voice recorders, a thermal camera, while trading barbs like seasoned rivals. Still convinced it's all bad insulation? Ethan asked, adjusting the tripod. Until proven otherwise, Laura said, crouching to check the EMF baseline. Science doesn't bend for ghost stories. Maybe it should, Ethan teased, his grin flashing in the dim light. Keeps life interesting. Laura smirked. Logic keeps life safe. Safe is boring, Ethan said, his tone rich with amusement. You're too smart to be boring. Laura blinked, heat rushing to her cheeks. Flattery won't make me believe in ghosts. Wasn't flattery, Ethan said softly. Just an observation. Laura looked away, her pulse skipping. Focus, she told herself. Equipment, not Ethan. The investigation unfolded in quiet tension, punctuated by the occasional creak of old wood. Laura catalogued every sound, every flicker of light, her skepticism steady, until the door slammed. Hard. Laura spun, her flashlight slicing through the dark. The door was shut tight, the knob refusing to budge when she tried it. Seriously? She muttered, tugging harder. It's stuck. Ethan joined her, his hand brushing hers as he tested the knob. Locked, he said, his voice calm but amused. Guess we're trapped. Laura stared at him. You're kidding. Do I look like I'm kidding? Ethan grinned, his eyes gleaming. Looks like it's just you, me, and the ghosts. Laura groaned, sinking onto the faded sofa. Perfect. Just perfect. Ethan sat beside her, his presence warm in the chill. Could be worse. How? Laura demanded. You could be stuck with Greg, Ethan said, his grin widening. He'd probably start building a rope ladder out of curtains. Laura laughed despite herself, the sound breaking the tension. Fair point. Minutes stretched into an hour, the silence thick except for the occasional hum of the EMF meter. Laura tried to focus on the readings, but her awareness kept drifting. To the way Ethan's arm brushed hers when he shifted, to the low timbre of his voice when he spoke. You know, Ethan said quietly, you're different from most skeptics. Laura arched a brow. How so? You don't dismiss everything, he said. You question, but you listen. That's rare. Laura hesitated, her fingers curling around the edge of the sofa. I like answers, she said softly, but I know I don't have all of them. Ethan's smile was gentle now, his eyes warm. That's what makes you interesting. Laura swallowed hard, her pulse thudding in her ears. You really don't give up, do you? Not when something matters, Ethan said, his voice low. And you matter. Laura's breath caught. For a moment, the room felt smaller, the air charged, like the space between them was humming with something unseen. She wanted to argue, to deflect, but the words tangled in her throat. The door finally creaked open, Tom's sheepish face appearing in the gap. Sorry, old lock jammed. Laura shot to her feet, her cheeks flushed. No problem, she said briskly, grabbing her tote. Let's finish the sweep. Ethan followed, his grin back in place but softer now, like he was holding a secret. Laura didn't look at him. She couldn't. Not yet. Because for the first time, she wasn't sure if the thing haunting her was the inn, or the man walking beside her. Chapter 8, Unseen Forces. Laura had always trusted her senses. Sight, sound, touch. They were the anchors that kept her grounded in a world full of superstition and shadows. But tonight, in the east wing of the inn, those anchors slipped. The group had split up again, their voices fading down the long hallway. Laura and Ethan moved through a narrow corridor lined with doors, the wallpaper curling like brittle parchment. Her flashlight beam danced across the floorboards, catching dust motes that shimmered like tiny ghosts. Feels different tonight, Ethan murmured, his voice low. Laura smirked. That's because it's colder. Not just colder, Ethan said, his eyes scanning the dark. Heavier. Laura rolled her eyes, but her pulse ticked faster. Atmosphere, she said briskly. Old buildings have personality. Personality? Ethan repeated, his grin faint. That's one way to put it. They entered a small bedroom at the end of the hall, a space frozen in time. A brass bed sat against the wall, its quilt faded to pale ghosts of color. A cracked vanity mirror reflected their flashlight beams in jagged shards. Laura set her tote on the dresser, pulling out the EMF meter. The lights glowed steady green. Normal. Predictable. She exhaled, tension easing, until the door clicked shut behind them. Laura turned sharply. Did you? Ethan shook his head, his expression calm but alert. Old hinges, he said, though his tone lacked conviction. Laura crossed to the door, testing the knob. Turned easily. Not locked. Still, the air felt wrong. Thicker. Like the room was holding its breath. Draft, she muttered, scanning the window. But the glass was intact, the frame sealed tight. No breeze. No sound. Just silence pressing against her ears. And then the temperature dropped. Not a gentle chill. A sudden plunge, sharp enough to raise goosebumps along her arms. Laura froze, her breath fogging in the beam of her flashlight. Ethan, she whispered. I feel it, he said softly, stepping closer. His presence was warm against the cold, his voice steady even as the EMF meter spiked, green lights flaring into red. Laura stared at the blinking device, her heart pounding. Could be interference, she said automatically, but the words sounded hollow. In a room with no power? Ethan's eyes held hers, calm and certain. Laura. Before she could answer, the mirror cracked. A sharp, splintering sound that sliced through the silence. Laura spun, her flashlight catching the jagged fracture spreading across the glass like a spiderweb. Her breath hitched, her pulse thundering in her ears. Earthquake? She whispered, though the floor was steady beneath her feet. No, Ethan said, his voice low. Not that. Laura's throat tightened. For the first time, she had no explanation. No logic to cling to. Just the cold, the silence, and the mirror bleeding shadows. Her knees wobbled, and Ethan was there, his arm wrapping around her, pulling her close. Hey, he murmured, his breath warm against her hair. It's okay. Laura gripped his jacket, her fingers trembling. I don't. You don't have to, Ethan said gently. Not right now. She pressed her face against his chest, the steady beat of his heart anchoring her in the storm of uncertainty. For a moment, the world narrowed to the warmth of his arms, the strength of his voice, the way he held her like she mattered. When she finally pulled back, her cheeks flushed, Ethan's eyes were soft, his grin gone, replaced by something deeper, something that made Laura's breath catch. You okay? He asked quietly. Laura nodded, though her voice was shaky. Yeah, just surprised. Ethan smiled faintly. Surprised is good. Laura laughed weakly, shaking her head. You're impossible. Maybe, Ethan said, his tone rich with warmth. But admit it, you're starting to believe. Laura didn't answer. She couldn't, because for the first time, she wasn't sure what she believed. Chapter 9, Confessions in the Dark. The storm rolled in like a warning, thunder growling low, rain slashing against the windows of the old mill where tonight's investigation was set. Laura stood under the dripping awning, clutching her jacket tighter as lightning split the sky. Perfect, she thought grimly. Nothing says rational science like chasing ghosts in a building that looks like the set of a horror movie during a thunderstorm. Inside, the mill was a cathedral of shadows. Rusted machinery loomed like skeletal giants, and the air smelled of oil and damp wood. The group's voices echoed faintly as they scattered to their assigned zones, leaving Laura and Ethan in the cavernous main hall. Romantic, isn't it? Ethan said, his grin flashing in the beam of his flashlight. Laura shot him a look. If your idea of romance involves tetanus and mildew, sure. Ethan laughed, the sound warm against the chill. You're fun when you're grumpy. I'm practical, Laura corrected, sweeping her light across the floor. And practicality says this place is a lawsuit waiting to happen. Good thing we're not lawyers, Ethan said, his tone teasing. Come on, let's set up. They worked in silence for a while, the storm outside punctuating the quiet with sharp cracks of thunder. Laura tried to focus on the EMF meter, the voice recorder, the thermal camera, but her thoughts kept drifting. To the way Ethan's hand brushed hers when he passed her the tripod. To the warmth in his voice when he said her name. She hated that it mattered. Hated that the memory of his arms around her in the inn still lingered like a phantom touch. Laura, Ethan said suddenly, his voice softer now. Can I ask you something? She glanced up, her pulse skipping. Depends. Why do you do this? He asked, his eyes steady on hers. If you don't believe, why keep chasing shadows? Laura hesitated, her fingers curling around the edge of the table. Because I like answers, she said quietly. And because, maybe part of me wonders if I'm wrong. Ethan's smile was gentle, his eyes warm. That's honest. Laura shrugged, her throat tight. What about you? Why keep looking after all these years? Ethan's gaze flickered, shadows crossing his face. Because I need to believe, he said softly. After my sister, it's the only thing that makes sense. The idea that she's not just gone. Laura's breath caught. She wanted to say something. Comfort, logic, anything. But the words tangled in her chest. Instead, she reached out, her fingers brushing his hand. The contact was electric. Ethan's eyes widened, then softened, his fingers curling around hers like it was the most natural thing in the world. The storm raged outside, wind howling through broken panes, and the mill seemed to hum with unseen energy. Laura felt it, not just in the air, but in the space between them. A charge, a pull like gravity had shifted. Laura? Ethan murmured, his voice low, his breath warm against the chill. If I kiss you right now, would you stop me? Laura's heart slammed against her ribs. Logic screamed at her to step back, to deflect, to laugh it off. But logic felt far away, drowned out by the thunder, the shadows, and the way his eyes held hers like a promise. No, she whispered. And then his lips were on hers, soft, warm, tasting faintly of rain and something sweeter. The kiss was slow at first, tentative like a question. Then deeper, surer, like an answer neither of them had been brave enough to speak. When they finally broke apart, breathless, Laura pressed her forehead against his, her pulse a wild drumbeat. You're impossible, she murmured. Ethan smiled, his voice rough with emotion. Maybe, but admit it, you're starting to believe. Laura laughed softly, shaking her head. In ghosts? No. In us, Ethan asked, his grin turning tender. Laura swallowed hard, her smile trembling. Maybe. Outside, the storm began to ease, the thunder fading into distant murmurs. Inside, Laura felt something shift, something bigger than skepticism, bigger than fear. Something that felt like the start of a story she hadn't planned to write. Chapter 10, The Fallout. Laura had always prided herself on balance, logic over chaos, reason over impulse. But after the storm, after the kiss, balance felt like a foreign concept. She sat at her kitchen table Sunday morning, staring at her untouched coffee. The city hummed outside her window, oblivious to the hurricane inside her chest. She should feel triumphant. Another investigation, another night of anomalies explained. Except, she hadn't explained them. Not the temperature drop, not the EMF spike, not the mirror cracking like a warning, and definitely not the way Ethan's lips had felt against hers. Laura pressed her palms to her eyes, groaning softly. What are you doing? This wasn't her. She didn't get swept up in storms, literal or metaphorical. She didn't let feelings tangle with facts. And yet, here she was tangled beyond repair. Her phone buzzed. A message from Maya. Friday was wild. Can't wait for the next hunt. Also, you and Ethan? I spill. Laura stared at the screen, heat rushing to her cheeks. Great. So everyone noticed. She typed a quick reply, nothing to spill. Focus on ghosts, not gossip. And tossed the phone aside. But the truth was harder to ignore. Something had shifted Friday night, and Laura didn't know how to unshift it. The next meeting was tense from the start. The group gathered in the library, their chatter lively, but Laura felt the undercurrent. A hum of curiosity, a flicker of glances. Maya's grin was practically neon. Sophie's serene smile held secrets. Even Tom looked like he wanted to ask questions. And then Ethan walked in. He looked the same, dark jacket, easy confidence, but his grin was missing. His eyes flicked to Laura, then away, like he was holding something back. Laura's stomach tightened. All right, team, Ethan said, his voice brisk. Tonight, we review evidence from the mill and plan next steps. Laura forced herself to focus as videos played. Audio clips hummed, and theories flew. But her mind kept drifting, to the way Ethan avoided her gaze, to the space between them that felt wider than the room. When the meeting ended, Laura lingered, hoping for a word, a smile, anything. Ethan packed up quickly, his movements sharp, his tone polite but distant. Ethan, Laura said finally, her voice low. Can we talk? He paused, his jaw tight. Not here. Laura's pulse thudded. Then where? Ethan hesitated, then shook his head. Laura, maybe we shouldn't. The words hit like a cold wind. What do you mean? Ethan's eyes met hers, shadows flickering in their depths. This, whatever it is, it complicates things. For you. For me. For the group. Laura swallowed hard, her throat tight. Complicates or matters? Ethan's smile was faint, almost broken. Both. And then he was gone, leaving Laura standing in the echo of silence, her heart pounding like a question with no answer. That night, Laura sat on her couch, the city lights blurring through her tears. She hated crying, hated feeling like a character in someone else's story. But she couldn't shake the ache, the sense that something real had slipped through her fingers. She told herself to focus on facts, on logic, on the next investigation. But all she could think about was Ethan's voice, soft and certain. You matter. And for the first time, Laura wondered if believing in ghosts was easier than believing in love. Chapter 11, The Big Reveal. Laura had never been so determined to prove herself right, and so terrified she might be wrong. The group's next investigation was at the old courthouse, a hulking monument of stone and shadows that loomed against the winter sky. Reports of footsteps in empty halls, voices echoing where no one stood, and Laura's personal favorite, a glowing figure near the judge's bench. Perfect fodder for superstition. Perfect opportunity for science. She arrived early, her tote heavy with gear. Tonight wasn't just about ghosts. Tonight was about answers. About reclaiming the balance that had slipped through her fingers since the storm, since the kiss, since Ethan's quiet retreat. Laura set up her equipment with surgical precision. EMF meters, thermal camera, voice recorders. She checked every battery, every setting, every angle. If there was an explanation, she would find it. The group trickled in, their chatter lively, but Laura barely heard them. Her focus was razor-sharp until Ethan walked through the door. He looked the same, dark jacket, easy stride, but his grin was missing, replaced by something quieter. His eyes met hers for a fraction of a second, then slid away. Laura's chest tightened, but she forced herself to keep moving, keep working, keep pretending she wasn't unraveling inside. The investigation began. The courthouse swallowed their voices, its marble floors gleaming like frozen rivers. Laura moved through the echoing halls, her flashlight slicing through the dark, her pulse ticking like a metronome. And then it happened. The thermal camera, steady all night, flared with color. A sudden bloom of heat in the shape of a figure, standing near the judge's bench. Laura froze, her breath catching. No, she whispered, adjusting the lens. Glitch. It's a glitch. But the image held. A silhouette, faint but undeniable. And then gone. Laura's hands trembled as she checked the readings. No heat source. No malfunction. Just nothing. Except the spike on the EMF meter, sharp and sudden, like a heartbeat in the silence. Her throat tightened. For the first time, she had no explanation. No logic to cling to. Just data that defied her certainty. She found Ethan in the hallway, his expression alert. You okay? He asked, his voice low. Laura swallowed hard, her fingers curling around the thermal camera. I saw something, she said, her tone shaky. On the camera. And the EMF. Ethan's eyes softened, shadows flickering in their depths. Show me. She did. And for once, Ethan didn't grin. He didn't tease. He just looked at her, his voice quiet. This is real, Laura. Laura shook her head, her breath uneven. I don't know. I can't explain it. Ethan stepped closer, his presence warm against the chill. You don't have to explain everything. Laura met his gaze, her heart pounding. But that's who I am. Maybe, Ethan said gently, but maybe you're more. The silence stretched heavy and tender. Laura felt the weight of her own walls, the ones she'd built from logic and certainty, cracking under the force of something bigger. Something she couldn't measure or quantify. something that felt like truth. "I'm scared," she whispered, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Ethan's hand found hers, his grip steady. "Me too," he said softly. "But maybe that's how we know it matters." Laura stared at him, her pulse a wild drumbeat. And for the first time, she didn't fight the pull. She didn't argue or deflect. She just let herself believe. Not in ghosts, not entirely, but in the possibility of something she couldn't explain. Something like love. Chapter 12, Love and Logic. The courthouse was silent now, its marble halls echoing only with the memory of footsteps and whispers. Laura stood by the judge's bench, the thermal camera heavy in her hands, and felt the weight of everything. Logic, doubt, and the quiet truth blooming in her chest. She'd spent the last hour reviewing the footage, searching for flaws, for glitches, for anything that could restore the certainty she'd clung to for years. But the image remained, a figure where no figure should be, heat blooming in a room colder than winter breath. No wiring, no malfunction, no explanation. And for once, Laura didn't want one. She heard Ethan before she saw him, the soft tread of boots, the low hum of his voice as he spoke her name. She turned, her pulse skipping, and found him in the doorway, shadows curling around his shoulders like secrets. "You stayed," he said quietly. Laura nodded, her throat tight. "I needed to see it again." Ethan stepped closer, his eyes steady on hers. "And," Laura swallowed hard, her fingers curling around the edge of the bench. "And, I don't know," she whispered. "I can't explain it." Ethan's smile was gentle now, stripped of teasing, rich with something deeper. "You don't have to." Laura laughed softly, shaking her head. "That's hard for me." "I know," Ethan said, his voice warm. "But maybe, not everything needs an answer." Laura met his gaze, her heart pounding like a drum. "You really believe that?" "I believe in possibilities," Ethan said, his tone low, his eyes holding hers like a promise. "And in you." The words hit like sunlight breaking through clouds, soft, bright, undeniable. Laura felt something inside her shift, something that had been locked tight for years. She didn't fight it. She didn't argue. She just let herself breathe. "Ethan," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I'm scared." His hand found hers, his grip steady, his warmth anchoring her in the storm. "Me too," he said softly. "But maybe that's how we know it matters." Laura stared at him, her pulse a wild rhythm, and for the first time, she didn't think. She moved, closing the space between them, her lips finding his in a kiss that was everything the first had promised and more. Deep, certain, tasting of rain and hope and something sweeter than logic. When they broke apart, breathless, Laura pressed her forehead against his, laughter bubbling in her chest like champagne. "You're impossible," she murmured. "Maybe," Ethan said, his grin flashing like sunlight. "But admit it, you believe in something now." Laura smiled, her heart steady for the first time in weeks. "In ghosts?" "No. In us," Ethan asked, his voice rough with emotion. Laura swallowed hard, her smile trembling. "Absolutely." They left the courthouse hand in hand, the night air crisp and bright with stars. Laura felt lighter than she had in years, not because she'd found all the answers, but because she'd learned something better. That life wasn't about certainty. It was about wonder, about questions, about love, and maybe, just maybe, about ghosts. Chapter 13, Ghosts of Tomorrow, Epilogue. Laura Cruz had never imagined her life would look like this. A cozy apartment filled with laughter, a job that paid the bills without draining her soul, and a Friday night calendar that included ghost hunts and coffee dates with a man who made her believe in more than logic. She stood by her window, watching the city lights flicker like distant stars, her phone buzzing with a message from Ethan. "Meet at the library? New case. And yes, coffee first." Winking face, Laura smiled, her heart doing that ridiculous skip it had perfected over the past few weeks. She typed back, "On my way. But you're buying. Science demands tribute." His reply came instantly. "Deal. Bring your EMF meter." And that smile. Laura laughed, shaking her head as she grabbed her tote. The EMF meter was already inside, nestled among voice recorders and notebooks, a skeptic's toolkit that now felt like something more. Not because she believed in ghosts, not entirely, but because she believed in possibilities, in questions without easy answers, in the thrill of chasing mysteries with someone who made her heart race faster than any EMF spike. She locked the door behind her, stepping into the crisp night air. The city hummed around her, alive with stories, some written, some whispered, some waiting in the shadows. Laura didn't know what they'd find tonight. Maybe nothing, maybe everything. But for the first time, she didn't need certainty. Because life wasn't about proving or disproving. It was about wonder, about laughter, about love, and maybe, just maybe, about ghosts.